The marriage certificate still remains in the Louisiana State Archives, aged and fragile, displaying the names of Jeremiah Aldrich and Celeste, recorded simply as property under his signature. What makes this document so unsettling isn't merely the repulsive nature of the union between a plantation owner and his enslaved cook, but the 13 mysterious deaths that occurred in the months following their wedding ceremony in March 1854. Local newspapers from that period, carefully preserved in private collections, suggest a conspiracy so intricate and brutal that authorities concealed the investigation to protect some of Louisiana's most influential families. The reality behind this forced marriage exposes a network of betrayal, vengeance, and systematic torture that stunned even the violence-accustomed antebellum South. Before we proceed with the account of Jeremiah Aldrich and the nightmarish destiny that awaited him at Willowbrook Plantation, make sure to subscribe to our channel and inform us in the comments which state you're listening from. Now, let me transport you back to an era when honor meant everything and when broken trust could destroy a man in ways far more terrible than death. The incidents that led to that unholy marriage started 15 years earlier in the murky backwaters of the Mississippi Delta, where fortunes were built on human flesh and blood money flowed as freely as the muddy river itself. Jeremiah Aldrich wasn't born into the plantation aristocracy that characterized Louisiana society in the 1840s. The son of a failed tobacco farmer from Kentucky, he arrived in New Orleans in 1839 with nothing but ambition burning in his chest and a willingness to engage in business that more established gentlemen wouldn't touch with their finest gloves. The slave trade, while legal, carried a social stigma among the old Creole families, who preferred to maintain the illusion that their wealth came from sugar and cotton alone, not from the systematic buying and selling of human beings. It was in the sweltering summer of 1840 that Aldrich formed his partnership with Marcus Devereaux and Samuel Rochelle, two men whose desperation matched his own ruthless ambition. Devereaux, the youngest son of a declining sugar baron, needed money to save his family's crumbling plantation from creditors. Rochelle, a former ship captain who'd lost everything to yellow fever and bad investments, possessed invaluable knowledge of the illegal slave routes from Cuba and the Caribbean islands. Together, they established what they called the Delta Trading Company, operating from a warehouse on the outskirts of New Orleans, where the law's reach grew thin and questions weren't asked about the source of their merchandise. The business proved more profitable than any of them had dared imagine. While legitimate slave traders dealt in documented property with clear titles and health certificates, Aldrich's operations specialized in what they euphemistically called recovery services. They purchased enslaved people who had escaped from failed plantations, bought kidnapped free blacks from corrupt bounty hunters, and most lucratively smuggled fresh captives from illegal ships that still crossed the Atlantic. Despite the official ban on international slave trade, the profit margins were extraordinary because their operating costs were minimal. They cared nothing for the health, housing, or basic humanity of their merchandise. For 3 years, the partnership flourished in the shadows of New Orleans society. They reinvested their profits into legitimate businesses, buying respectability along with property. Devereaux saved his family's plantation and expanded it into one of the most productive sugar operations in St. Charles Parish. Rochelle purchased a fleet of riverboats and became a respected shipping magnate. Aldrich himself acquired Willowbrook Plantation, a modest but profitable cotton operation about 40 miles upriver from New Orleans, complete with a grand colonial mansion that announced his arrival into Louisiana's planter elite. But success bred carelessness, and carelessness attracted attention from people who mattered. In the spring of 1843, word reached them that federal marshals were investigating illegal slave trading operations along the Gulf Coast. Someone had been asking questions about their business, examining shipping records, and worst of all, interviewing some of their former merchandise who had managed to escape or gain freedom through other means. The three partners met in emergency session in Aldrich's new study at Willowbrook, surrounded by leather-bound books he couldn't read and oil paintings of ancestors who weren't his own. The tension in that room was suffocating as each man realized that their empire of human misery was about to collapse. Devereaux, always the most nervous of the three, suggested they should dissolve the partnership immediately and destroy all records of their transactions. Rochelle, with his sailor's pragmatism, argued for a more measured approach, shifting their assets offshore and waiting for the investigation to pass. But Aldrich had a different solution, one that revealed the true depths of his moral bankruptcy. He had already decided to eliminate his partners and steal their combined assets, but he needed a plan that would remove suspicion from himself while silencing the two men who knew enough to destroy him. The solution came to him with the cold clarity of pure evil. He would murder both men and arrange the scene to suggest they had killed each other in a dispute over money. With Devereaux and Rochelle dead, he would be the sole survivor of a tragic business disagreement, free to dispose of the evidence of their illegal activities while keeping all their accumulated wealth for himself. The murder took place on a humid evening in June 1843 at the warehouse that had served as their base of operations for 3 years. Aldrich had arranged the meeting under the pretense of planning their exit strategy from the slave trading business. He chose the location carefully. The warehouse district was largely abandoned after sunset, and the building itself was scheduled for demolition the following month as the city expanded its commercial port facilities. Aldrich arrived early, concealing a loaded pistol in his coat and a razor-sharp skinning knife in his boot. His plan was brutally simple: shoot Devereaux first, then stage a knife fight with Rochelle that would end with both men dead and him claiming self-defense. He had even prepared false witnesses, 3 men he'd hired from the docks who would swear they'd seen Devereaux and Rochelle arguing violently earlier that day over missing money from their accounts. When his partners arrived, they found Aldrich already seated at their usual planning table. A bottle of expensive whiskey and 3 glasses arranged between stacks of ledgers and shipping documents. The conversation began normally, with Devereaux reviewing the legal threats they faced and Rochelle outlining a plan to transfer their assets to banks in Havana, where American law couldn't reach them. But as the evening wore on and the whiskey flowed, Aldrich steered the discussion toward their accumulated wealth. Specifically the location of the cash reserves they'd hidden in various banks and safe houses around New Orleans. It was Rochelle who first sensed something wrong. The old sailor's instincts, honed by years of dangerous voyages and violent ports, picked up on subtle changes in Aldrich's demeanor. The way his eyes never quite met theirs, how his hand kept drifting toward his coat pocket, the tension in his voice when he asked about their individual account numbers and security arrangements. When Rochelle suggested they postpone the meeting and reconvene the following day with their lawyers present, Aldrich knew his window of opportunity was closing. The violence erupted with shocking suddenness. Aldrich drew his pistol and fired directly into Devereaux's chest before the younger man could react. The shot echoed through the empty warehouse like thunder, and Devereaux collapsed backward in his chair, blood spreading across his white shirt as his eyes went wide with shock and betrayal. But Rochelle, despite being caught off guard, proved more resilient than Aldrich had anticipated. The former sea captain overturned the heavy table between them and lunged forward with a broken whiskey bottle, slashing at Aldrich's face and opening a deep gash across his left cheek that would leave a permanent scar. What followed was a desperate struggle that lasted nearly 10 minutes, far longer than Aldrich had planned. Rochelle fought with the fury of a man who understood exactly what was happening and refused to die quietly. They crashed through crates of documents, scattered ledgers across the floor, and left blood trails on every surface as they grappled for control of the knife Aldrich had drawn from his boot. In the end, it was Rochelle's age that betrayed him. At 53, he simply couldn't match the younger man's strength and endurance. Aldrich finally managed to drive the blade deep into Rochelle's stomach, twisting it upward toward his heart, while the old sailor clawed desperately at his throat. But even as Rochelle died, he managed to gasp out words that would haunt Aldrich for the rest of his life. "My son knows everything. He'll come for you. When he's old enough, he'll make you pay." At the time, Aldrich dismissed these as the delusional ravings of a dying man. He had no idea that Marcus Devereaux's younger brother, Philippe, had been secretly documenting their illegal activities, or that Samuel Rochelle's 17-year-old son, Henri, possessed detailed knowledge of every transaction, every contact, and every crime the Delta Trading Company had committed over 3 years of operation. Aldrich spent the next 4 hours methodically arranging the crime scene to support his planned story. He placed Devereaux's body in a position suggesting the man had been shot while reaching for a weapon, then positioned Rochelle nearby with a bloody knife in his hand and defensive wounds that implied a struggle between the two victims. He scattered money around the room to suggest a dispute over finances, damaged the office safe to imply a robbery gone wrong, and even inflicted additional wounds on his own hands and arms to support his claim of being an innocent bystander caught in their violent confrontation. The false witnesses performed exactly as paid, testifying to police that they had seen Devereaux and Rochelle arguing earlier that evening about missing partnership funds. A corrupt dock worker claimed he'd heard shouting from the warehouse around the time of the murders, followed by gunshots and the sounds of a violent struggle. Most crucially, Aldrich had prepared a convincing explanation for his presence at the scene. He claimed he'd arrived to mediate the dispute between his partners, only to walk into a deadly confrontation that left him fighting for his own life. The New Orleans police, overwhelmed by more pressing crimes and eager to close a case involving 3 relatively respectable businessmen, accepted Aldrich's version of events with minimal investigation. The official report concluded that Devereaux and Rochelle had killed each other in a business dispute, with Aldrich barely escaping the same fate. Within a week, the warehouse was demolished as planned, destroying any remaining physical evidence of the partnership's illegal activities. With his partners dead and their assets suddenly available for claiming, Aldrich moved quickly to consolidate his newfound wealth. He presented himself as the surviving partner of a legitimate shipping company, producing carefully forged documents that showed Devereaux and Rochelle had agreed to transfer their shares to him in the event of their deaths. Banks that had been suspicious of 3 unknown men conducting large cash transactions readily accepted the word of a single plantation owner with a documented history of successful cotton production over the following months. Aldrich systematically emptied every account, safe deposit box, and hidden cash reserve that had belonged to his murdered partners. He estimated the total value at nearly $40,000, a fortune that would be worth over $1 million in today's currency. More importantly, he had eliminated the only 2 people who could connect him to the Delta Trading Company's illegal operations, leaving him free to reinvent himself as a respectable member of Louisiana society. But Aldrich had made a fatal miscalculation. In his obsessive focus on immediate threats and financial opportunities, he had completely ignored the families of the men he had murdered. Specifically, he had failed to consider that both Marcus Devereaux and Samuel Rochelle had younger relatives who would soon learn the truth about their deaths, and who would spend the next decade carefully, methodically, patiently planning a revenge so elaborate and devastating that death would seem like mercy compared to what they had in store for him. Philippe Devereaux was 22 years old when his brother Marcus was murdered. Unlike the older Devereaux men who had always prioritized immediate gratification over long-term planning, Philippe possessed a calculating intelligence that made him far more dangerous than Aldrich ever imagined. As Marcus's closest confidant and unofficial business manager, Philippe had maintained detailed records of every Delta Trading Company transaction, including coded ledgers that documented their illegal slave purchases, shipping manifests from prohibited Caribbean routes, and most damning of all, correspondence with corrupt officials who had facilitated their operations. More importantly, Philippe had never trusted Jeremiah Aldrich. Something about the Kentucky newcomer's eagerness to engage in the most brutal aspects of their business had struck Philippe as excessive, even by the standards of men who trafficked in human flesh. He had begun investigating Aldrich's background months before the murders, discovering inconsistencies in his stated history and financial irregularities that suggested far more complex motivations than simple greed. When news of Marcus's death reached Philippe at the family's struggling plantation, his first reaction wasn't grief but cold, calculating fury. The official story made no sense to anyone who actually knew the three partners. Marcus, while desperate for money, was fundamentally cautious and would never have confronted Samuel Rochelle in a violent manner. Rochelle, despite his rough sailor's background, was a methodical businessman who resolved disputes through negotiation, not knife fights, but most telling of all, Aldrich's account of the evening contained details that Philippe knew to be false, including references to money and accounts that had already been moved to different locations weeks earlier. Within days of the funeral, Philippe began his own investigation into the warehouse murders, using contacts from his brother's business network. He interviewed dock workers, examined shipping records, and even bribed police officers to review the official evidence. What he discovered confirmed his worst suspicions. The crime scene had been carefully staged, the witnesses had been paid to lie, and several crucial pieces of evidence had been deliberately overlooked or destroyed. Most importantly, he learned that Aldrich had begun accessing his murdered partner's financial assets within hours of their deaths, suggesting a level of preparation that contradicted his claim of being an innocent bystander. Meanwhile, Henri Rochelle was conducting his own investigation from a very different angle. At 24, Samuel's son possessed his father's maritime connections but combined them with a formal education in law and business that made him uniquely qualified to trace the financial aspects of the murders. Henry had spent several years working in New Orleans banks and shipping companies, building relationships with clerks, managers, and officials who could provide information that Philippe's more direct approach might miss. Henri's investigation revealed the true scope of Aldrich's theft. By carefully examining bank records, shipping manifests, and property transfers, he documented how the murderer had systematically looted every asset belonging to the Delta Trading Company partnership. Henry calculated that Aldrich had stolen over $60,000 in cash, property and business investments, wealth that represented years of illegal but profitable operations built on the suffering of hundreds of enslaved human beings. But what made Henri truly dangerous was his understanding of how Louisiana's financial and legal systems actually worked. Unlike Philippe, who was focused on proving Aldrich's guilt through direct evidence, Henri realized that a more effective approach would be to use Aldrich's own greed against him. Instead of seeking immediate justice through the corrupt court system, Henry began developing a plan to systematically destroy Aldrich's financial foundation, leaving him vulnerable to the same kind of betrayal and violence he had inflicted on others. The two young men met for the first time in the fall of 1844. more than a year after their relatives' murders. The meeting took place at a discreet restaurant in the French Quarter, where Philippe had arranged to share his evidence with Henri in hopes of coordinating their individual investigations. What neither man expected was how perfectly their different skills and resources complemented each other, or how completely their shared desire for justice would consume the next decade of their lives. By the spring of 1845, Philippe Devereaux and Henri Rochelle had transformed their individual quests for justice into something far more sophisticated and dangerous. A carefully coordinated conspiracy designed to destroy Jeremiah Aldrich through the same methods he had used to murder their relatives: betrayal, financial manipulation, and ultimately violence disguised as legitimate business. But unlike Aldrich's impulsive brutality, their approach would be methodical, patient, and absolutely devastating in its thoroughness. The first phase of their plan focused on infiltrating Aldrich's social and business networks. Philippe, using his family's remaining connections in Louisiana society, began frequenting the same gentlemen's clubs, political gatherings, and social events where Aldrich was establishing himself as a respectable planter. His goal wasn't to confront his brother's killer directly, but to study the man's habits, weaknesses, and most importantly, his financial vulnerabilities. Philippe was blessed with his late brother's charm and social skills, and within months he had positioned himself as one of Aldrich's casual acquaintances, someone trustworthy enough to share drinks with, but not significant enough to be considered a threat. Meanwhile, Henry was using his banking connections to trace every aspect of Aldrich's financial empire. He discovered that the plantation owner's apparent wealth was built on a foundation of risky investments, leveraged loans, and business ventures that generated impressive short-term profits but created long-term liabilities. Most crucially, Henry learned that Aldrich had developed a serious gambling problem, regularly losing thousands of dollars in high-stakes poker games and horse racing bets that he funded through increasingly desperate borrowing against his plantation's future crops. The gambling addiction gave them the perfect opening for their revenge. By 1848, Henry had secured employment with First National Bank of New Orleans, the institution that held the primary mortgage on Willowbrook Plantation. From this position, he was able to subtly manipulate Aldrich's credit arrangements, ensuring that loan renewals came with slightly higher interest rates, that payment schedules were structured to create cash flow problems during critical planting seasons, and that the plantation owner was gradually pushed toward the kind of financial desperation that made men vulnerable to manipulation. Simultaneously, Philippe had cultivated relationships with several of New Orleans' most notorious gambling operators, men who ran high-stakes games where fortunes could be won or lost in a single evening. Through carefully placed bribes and promises of future favors, Philippe arranged for Aldrich to be invited to increasingly expensive games where the stakes were higher and the other players were secretly working together to ensure that the plantation owner would lose far more than he could afford. The beauty of their approach was its patience and subtlety. Rather than confronting Aldrich directly or seeking quick revenge through violence, they were systematically destroying the financial foundation that supported his social position and self-image. Every loan that came due created stress, every gambling loss deepened his desperation, and every failed attempt to raise quick cash through risky investments pushed him closer to the kind of complete ruin that would leave him vulnerable to whatever final punishment they chose to inflict. By 1851, their efforts were beginning to show results. Aldrich's debts had grown to nearly $30,000, and the interest payments alone were consuming most of his plantation's annual profits. He had been forced to sell several parcels of his land to cover gambling losses, and rumors were circulating among Louisiana's planter elite that Willowbrook Plantation was in serious financial trouble. More importantly, Aldrich's personality was beginning to show the strain of constant financial pressure. He had become short-tempered, suspicious of his neighbors' motives, and increasingly desperate in his attempts to find new sources of income. But Philippe and Henri were not content with mere financial ruin. Their ultimate goal was to subject Aldrich to the same kind of humiliation and terror that their murdered relatives had experienced in their final moments. They wanted him to understand that his prosperity had been built on blood, that his respectability was a fiction, and that justice had finally found him despite all his careful planning and brutal efficiency. The final phase of their revenge would require them to push Aldrich beyond mere financial desperation into a position where he would be forced to accept whatever terms they offered, no matter how degrading or dangerous those terms might be. They needed him to be so completely trapped that death would seem preferable to the alternatives. But they also needed him alive long enough to fully appreciate the sophisticated nature of their vengeance. It was Henri who conceived the idea of using Aldrich's own enslaved people as instruments of his destruction. Every plantation owner lived in constant fear of slave rebellion, and that fear could be exploited by men who understood the psychological dynamics of the master-slave relationship. But rather than inciting an actual uprising, which would be both dangerous and morally problematic, Henri suggested a more subtle approach. They would use Aldrich's marriage to one of his own enslaved people as the ultimate humiliation, a public degradation that would destroy his social standing while leaving him legally powerless to escape the consequences. The selection of Celeste as the instrument of Aldrich's final humiliation was not random. Philippe and Henri had spent months studying every person who lived and worked at Willowbrook Plantation, looking for someone whose forced marriage to their target would create the maximum possible social damage, while also providing them with a reliable means of controlling Aldrich's ultimate fate. Celeste met all their requirements perfectly, but for reasons that went far deeper than her physical appearance or social status. At 38 years old, Celeste was indeed a large woman, but her size was the least remarkable thing about her from Philippe and Henri's perspective. What made her invaluable to their plans was her intelligence, her complete loyalty to her own survival, and most importantly, her absolute hatred for Jeremiah Aldrich. Unlike many enslaved people who had learned to hide their true feelings behind masks of compliance, Celeste had never bothered to conceal her contempt for the man who owned her. She performed her duties as head cook efficiently and without complaint, but anyone who observed her carefully could see the cold fury that burned behind her eyes whenever Aldrich was present. Her hatred had deep roots. Celeste had been purchased by Aldrich in 1847 from a failed plantation in Mississippi, where she had been separated from her husband and 3 children who were sold to different owners in different states. The separation was not economically necessary. Aldrich could have afforded to purchase her entire family, but he had chosen to buy only Celeste because he needed an experienced cook and saw no profit in acquiring what he dismissively called unnecessary mouths to feed. When Celeste had begged him to at least purchase her youngest child, a 10-year-old daughter, Aldrich had laughed and told her that he was running a plantation, not an orphanage for colored children. For 7 years, Celeste had endured the daily humiliation of preparing elaborate meals for the man who had destroyed her family, serving him expensive delicacies while she survived on scraps and kitchen leftovers. She had watched him entertain guests with stories of his business successes, knowing that his wealth had been built on stolen money and murdered partners. She had cleaned blood from his clothes when he returned from mysterious nighttime trips, and she had seen him burn documents and letters in the kitchen fireplace during his increasingly desperate attempts to hide evidence of his financial troubles. More importantly, Celeste had gradually accumulated detailed knowledge of Aldrich's daily routines, his personal habits, his health problems, and his growing paranoia about potential threats from creditors and business rivals. She knew which foods he preferred, which medicines he took for his chronic stomach ailments, and which rooms of the plantation house he visited most frequently. This knowledge made her a perfect potential ally for anyone seeking to manipulate or harm her owner, but it also made her extremely valuable to Philippe and Henri's specific plans for revenge. The approach to Celeste required delicate handling. Neither Philippe nor Henri could risk direct contact with an enslaved person on Aldrich's property, as such contact would be both legally dangerous and likely to arouse suspicion. Instead, they used intermediaries, free people of color who worked in New Orleans markets and had legitimate reasons for occasional visits to rural plantations. Through these contacts, they gradually established communication with Celeste, initially offering small amounts of money in exchange for information about Aldrich's activities and habits. What they discovered exceeded their expectations. Celeste not only possessed detailed knowledge of her owner's vulnerabilities, but she had been conducting her own subtle campaign of psychological warfare against him for years. She had been deliberately oversalting his food to aggravate his stomach problems, accidentally breaking his favorite dishes and personal items, and spreading rumors among the other enslaved people about his financial troubles and potential plans to sell them to cover his debts. Her actions had been careful and deniable, designed to create stress and paranoia without providing clear evidence of deliberate sabotage. When Philippe and Henri finally revealed their true identities and their plans for Aldrich's destruction, Celeste's response was immediate and unequivocal. She would do whatever was necessary to help them destroy the man who had murdered their relatives and ruined her own life. The only condition she demanded was that her cooperation be rewarded with freedom and safe passage to Canada, where she hoped to eventually locate her surviving children. Philippe and Henri agreed immediately, recognizing that they had found not just a tool for their revenge, but a partner whose personal motivations aligned perfectly with their own quest for justice. The final details of their plan took shape over several months of careful coordination. Aldrich would be pushed into complete financial ruin through a series of manipulated gambling losses and called loans, leaving him vulnerable to an offer he could not refuse: marry Celeste in a legal ceremony or face immediate death at the hands of his creditors. The marriage would destroy his social standing and provide Philippe and Henri with legal access to his property through their control of his wife. Most importantly, it would place Celeste in a position where she could gradually poison Aldrich over several months, causing him to suffer the same slow, agonizing death that their murdered relatives had experienced. But the plan required one more crucial element: timing. They needed to ensure that Aldrich's financial collapse coincided with a period when he would be isolated from potential allies and unable to seek help from law enforcement or political connections. The opportunity came in early 1854 when Henri learned that Aldrich was planning to attend a high-stakes gambling tournament in New Orleans, hoping to win enough money to save his plantation from foreclosure. It would be the perfect moment to spring their trap, when Aldrich would be desperate enough to accept any terms that offered hope of survival, no matter how degrading those terms might prove to be. The gambling den where Jeremiah Aldrich would meet his fate was located in a converted warehouse near the New Orleans waterfront, a place where the city's most desperate and dangerous men gathered to risk everything on the turn of a card or the roll of dice. The February evening in 1854 when Aldrich arrived was particularly humid and oppressive, with fog rolling off the Mississippi River to shroud the streets in a gray mist that seemed to muffle sound and blur the boundaries between reality and nightmare. Aldrich entered the den carrying a leather satchel containing $8,000. Nearly every liquid asset he could scrape together through the sale of slaves, equipment, and personal property from Willowbrook Plantation. It represented his last, desperate attempt to win enough money to satisfy his creditors and save his plantation from foreclosure. What he didn't know was that Philippe Devereaux and Henri Rochelle had been carefully orchestrating this moment for months, ensuring that every other player at the high-stakes table would be working together to strip him of his remaining wealth. The game was 5-card stud poker, played with stakes that started at $500 per hand and escalated quickly as the evening progressed. Aldrich initially experienced moderate success, winning enough smaller pots to believe that his luck might finally be changing. But as the stakes increased and the alcohol flowed more freely, he began making increasingly reckless bets, driven by a combination of desperation and the false confidence that came from his early wins. By midnight, Aldrich had lost more than half of his stake, but he continued playing with the desperate intensity of a man who understood that this was literally his last chance to save himself from complete ruin. The other players, following Philippe's careful instructions, allowed him to win occasional hands to keep him at the table, but gradually increased the pressure until he was betting amounts that represented his entire remaining fortune on single draws of cards. The final hand began just after 2 in the morning, when the fog outside had grown so thick that the gaslight from the street lamps barely penetrated the warehouse windows. Aldrich was dealt what appeared to be a strong hand, a pair of kings, showing with the possibility of a full house if the hidden cards fell correctly. Confident that this was his moment to recover his losses and perhaps even win enough to solve his financial problems permanently, he pushed his remaining $3,000 into the center of the table. But the other players had been dealt even stronger hands, and more importantly, they had been coordinating their bets to ensure that the final pot would be large enough to completely bankrupt Aldrich while leaving him with debts far exceeding anything he could possibly repay. When the cards were finally revealed, Aldrich's pair of kings lost to a full house held by a man he didn't recognize. A cold-eyed stranger who collected the winnings with the methodical efficiency of someone who had been certain of the outcome from the beginning. As the reality of his complete financial destruction began to sink in, Aldrich sat frozen at the empty table, staring at the felt surface where his last hope had just evaporated. The other players had already departed, but the stranger who had won the final hand remained seated across from him, studying Aldrich with the intensity of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. After several minutes of oppressive silence, the stranger finally spoke, his voice carrying a slight French accent that seemed familiar, but which Aldrich couldn't immediately place. "Mr. Aldrich," the man said, "I believe we need to discuss your outstanding obligations. You see, the gentlemen who just departed are not merely gamblers. They represent certain business interests that have been very patient with your financial difficulties. But patience, like luck, eventually runs out." It was at this moment that Philippe Devereaux stepped out of the shadows near the warehouse entrance, his face illuminated by the flickering gaslight in a way that made his resemblance to his murdered brother unmistakably clear. Aldrich's blood turned to ice as he recognized the features he had seen twisted in pain and shock 11 years earlier when Marcus Devereaux had died with a bullet in his chest and betrayal in his eyes. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Jeremiah," Philippe said, moving closer to the table with predatory grace. "Perhaps because you have. My name is Philippe Devereaux, and I believe you knew my older brother Marcus quite well. In fact, you were the last person to see him alive, weren't you?" The warehouse suddenly felt impossibly cold despite the humid Louisiana air outside. Aldrich's hands began to shake as the full scope of his situation became clear. This had never been a random gambling tournament or a chance to save his plantation. It had been an elaborate trap, planned and executed with the kind of methodical precision that spoke of years of patient preparation and unlimited hatred. Henry Rochelle emerged from another corner of the warehouse, completing the triangle of accusers that surrounded Aldrich at the poker table. "My father Samuel always said you were clever, Mr. Aldrich. Clever enough to murder 2 men and steal their life's work. But apparently not clever enough to realize that dead men sometimes leave behind sons who remember their father's stories and never forget their father's killers." The warehouse fell silent, except for the distant sound of ship horns echoing across the fog-shrouded river. Aldrich sat paralyzed between his accusers, his mind racing through possible escapes and finding none. He was alone in an isolated building, with 2 men who had spent over a decade planning his destruction, and his complete financial ruin meant that no one would be looking for him if he simply disappeared into the Mississippi Delta. Philippe moved to the chair directly across from Aldrich, settling himself with deliberate care before speaking again. "We know everything, Jeremiah. We know about the Delta Trading Company and your illegal slave trading operations. We know about the warehouse where you murdered our fathers in cold blood. We know about the forged documents and the bribed witnesses and the systematic theft of everything they had worked to build. Most importantly, we know that you've been living on blood money for 11 years, building your respectable plantation lifestyle on the foundation of their corpses." Henri approached from the other side, producing a leather folder filled with documents that he spread across the poker table like evidence in a courtroom. "These are copies of every financial transaction you've made since 1843, Mr. Aldrich. Bank records showing how you looted our fathers' accounts, property transfers demonstrating how you acquired assets that rightfully belonged to their estates, even correspondence with some of the corrupt officials who helped you cover your tracks. Officials who have since become far more concerned with their own survival than with protecting yours. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniably authentic." Aldrich recognized documents he thought had been destroyed years ago, financial records that could only have been obtained through extensive investigation and careful bribes, and most damning of all, sworn statements from people who had witnessed various aspects of his crimes but had remained silent until now. Philippe and Henri had built a case that would not only prove his guilt in any court of law, but would also implicate dozens of other prominent Louisiana citizens who had unknowingly helped him launder his stolen wealth. "The question now," Philippe continued, "is what we intend to do with this information. We could turn it over to federal authorities, who would be very interested in prosecuting not only you, but everyone who helped you integrate stolen money into Louisiana's banking system. Or we could arrange for certain parties in New Orleans to learn that you've been operating under false pretenses for over a decade, living a lie built on the murder of their business associates and friends. I suspect that either approach would result in your death, probably preceded by considerable unpleasantness." Aldrich finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. "What do you want? Money? I can get money. My plantation is worth—" "Your plantation is worthless," Henri interrupted. "We hold the mortgage, remember, along with most of your other debts. We've been systematically acquiring your obligations for years, Mr. Aldrich. Every loan you've taken, every gambling debt you've accumulated, every financial arrangement that's kept you afloat, it all belongs to us now. You have nothing left to bargain with except your life, and frankly, we're not particularly interested in preserving that either. The warehouse seemed to grow colder as the implications of their words sank in. Aldrich was not just bankrupt. He was completely at their mercy, dependent on their whims for his continued existence. Everything he had built, every comfort he had enjoyed, every aspect of the respectable life he had constructed had been systematically stripped away by the sons of the men he had murdered. But as terrifying as his situation was, some part of his mind still refused to accept that death was inevitable. There is, however, one alternative, Philippe said, his voice taking on a tone of mock consideration. One way you might be permitted to continue breathing, at least for a while longer. It would require a certain sacrifice of dignity on your part, a public acknowledgement of your true nature and a demonstration of your complete submission to our authority. Henry smiled with the cold satisfaction of a man who was about to reveal the culmination of years of careful planning.